May 29, 1108 AD, the troops of Alfonso VI of Leon have marched from Toledo to liberate Uclés from the siege to which the Almoravids had subjected it under the watchful eye of the Alcazaba garrison. Both armies face each other to decide the future of the city. El Cid has died, but the war between the Christians and the Almoravid Empire must continue. After Rodrigo's death, his troops abandoned Valencia in the year 1102, being conquered by the Almoravids. So this is more or less the situation of the Iberian Peninsula. In the year 1106, Yusuf, who had defeated Alfonso, king of Leon, several times, died. And he was succeeded by his son Yusuf. Yes, to avoid confusion with the names, they gave him the same name. 2 years after ascending to the throne, it was time to launch a conquest campaign against the Leonese. Yusuf ordered his brother Tamim to take command of the army. And in early May of the year 1108, the Muslim host began to gather in Granada. From there they departed to Baeza, and along the way the troops from Cordoba joined them. Once in Baeza, reinforcements from Valencia and Murcia arrived. There could only be one objective, Toledo. The Christian spies peppered the royal court with messages, warning that a large army was heading to Toledo to conquer the royal city. Of course, upon receiving the same information from several spies, the kingdom's troops were summoned, but not by the king, as he was convalescing from a wound recently received in battle. It was done by the Infante Sancho, who was about 14 years old. But of course he was advised by the famous Alvar Fanny, who had fought in Sagrajas years ago. Here above, I leave you the video of that battle. The army was made up of about 3,000 men, among whom it is worth mentioning Garcia Ordóñez, sworn enemy of the already deceased Cid. I also have to mention 7 counts of the kingdom who came with their own troops, while the Christian hosts were gathering in Toledo and deciding how to face the invader. The Almoravids continued to advance north at a standard speed, looting, as was usual, the territory through which they passed. However, 1 or 2 days' march from Toledo, they abruptly changed direction and quickened their pace. And where were they going? No one knew for sure, but all signs pointed to the target being Uclés, a lightly defended city east of Toledo. Think that since this happens, there is a process. The Leonese explorer must realize, make sure that the new direction is firm, gallop to Toledo, give the message to the king, and then the monarch must make a decision and mobilize the army. Precious time that the Almoravids would take advantage of. The Saracen army arrived in Uclés on May 27th, and their warriors ravaged the city like a plague. The Castilian garrison, which did not expect this attack, could not defend the town and fled to the fortress that dominated the city. The Muslims wreaked havoc in the town. They burned, looted, murdered, destroyed the church, and took some prisoners. The Mudejars of the city, that is Muslims who lived in Christian territory, welcomed the Almoravids as liberators and helped them in every way they could. They laid siege to the Alcazaba, but without siege machinery, it would be very complicated to take it. The next day, some assaults were carried out, but by midday they stopped their attempts. They had spotted Sancho's army approaching the city from afar. Tamim's first intention was to order the retreat. Why? Because if they fought, they risked the garrison of Uclés coming out and attacking them from the rear, leaving the Muslims fighting on 2 fronts at the same time. But then, a Mudejar who had deserted from the Christian army arrived and detailed exactly what the Christian forces were like and what strategy they were going to use in the battle. The Muslims would fight. At dawn on Friday, May 29th, the Saracen troops formed on the battlefield and the Leonese imitated them. However, just in case, they left a small group of warriors watching the Uclés garrison in case they decided to come out during the battle. The Leonese army had Alvaro Fanés in the center. On the right wing, the Infante Sancho accompanied by Garcia Ordóñez, while the right wing was led by various counts. The heavy cavalry was at the forefront. something that the Leonese and Castilians were accustomed to and that lately was not yielding good results. At Sancho's command, the battle began. The heavy cavalry at the forefront started to trot while the infantry began to slowly advance towards the enemy. The Saracen troops, following the tactic known at the time as tournefuy, waited in their positions. Gradually, the gap between the knights and the infantry widened, until the cavalry crashed thunderously against the Cordoban lines. As expected, the infantry line wavered from the harsh charge. Cordobans fell, pierced by the heavy Leonese spears, trampled by the horses, or simply knocked down by the trauma of the blow. Many others were injured and morale plummeted, but the line did not break. The Cordobans, however, began to retreat in formation, seeking the support of the Granadian infantry that waited in the rear. The Leonese vanguard began to advance, moving into the gap that was forming between the Saracen flanks. When the rest of the Christian army was ready, the Saracen flank infantry charged against the Christian flanks, while their light cavalry moved from the flank to the wings and moved away from the combat. The Christian targets, led by riders, launched their own charge. Alvar Fañez's infantry also charged against the Cordobans and Granadians, supporting their knights. And then the trap of the turnbuckle closed. The Saracen light cavalry galloped towards the Christian rear and charged against the flanks and the Leonese center. Here I want to make a parenthesis. Yes, after the battle we are all excellent generals who had won. In hindsight, we are all smart and brave. But man, it's a tactic against which the Christian kingdoms have already lost several times, like for example in the one I mentioned before Sagracias. Now again, don't they change tactics? Well, yes, again the Christian army was surrounded, attacked from all fronts, and what was happening with the garrison of Uclés? It's true that if they had made a sortie, they could have tried to save their brothers in arms more for the fall of Moral Saracena when they saw themselves attacked on two fronts than for the real damage they could do. However, they decided to stay behind their walls and wait for the outcome of the battle. The situation was desperate, but it would get even worse. The infant Sancho was fighting, but his horse was injured and threw him to the ground. Garcia Ordóñez, his faithful protector, jumped from his steed and sword in hand tried to protect him. Fighting with sword and shield, he managed to take down various arracheros who tried to end the Leonese leadership, but then they cut off his foot. The Count, unable to stand, threw himself on top of the infant to cover him with his own body. There he received numerous sword and spear thrusts to the back that ended his life. Word spread and Alfonso's men hurried to save the infant. They managed to form a circle around him, put him on a horse, and ordered the retreat. The Christians, as best they could, managed to break through the Muslim rearguard and flee the battle, but also ordered a relentless pursuit. The bulk of the army marched to Toledo, but since the infant had been injured, he and his 7 counts diverted to the castle of Belichon, which was near Uclés. However, their mounts were heavier and therefore slower than the Muslims, and they would soon catch up with them. The 7 counts made an oath. It was decided that the infant would continue the flight to Belinchon, and the counts would give their lives to stop the Saracens. So it was. Sancho continued at a gallop, leaving behind the 7 magnificent men of Leon. The place of the last battle of these 7 men would be named by the Muslim as the place of the 7 pigs. But shortly after, the Christians would rename it as the place of the 7 counts. The counts lowered the protector of their helmets, turned their horses 180 degrees, and formed a line facing the Muslim cavalry that was approaching at full speed. The counts pressed the shield against themselves, spurred their mounts, and launched into a trot. They increased to a gallop, lowered their lances, spurred their horses one last time to reach collision speed, and impacted against their pursuers. After losing their lances, they unsheathed their swords and continued fighting. But there were too many enemies, and they were only 7. One by one they fell, giving their lives to save their king, but not just their king. They were giving their lives for the kingdom's only male heir. Finally, the magnificent 7 of Leon were defeated, and the pursuit resumed. But good news, the heir made it to Balinchon, where he would be safe from his pursuers, right? Well, no. The Muslim population of the castle, upon learning what was happening, rose up in arms, executed the Christian garrison, and killed the infant Sancho. A hard blow for the kingdom, but there's still more. From the fortress of Uclés, they could observe the macabre spectacle with which the Almoravids celebrated their victory. They killed all the wounded Christians from the battle, taking no prisoners. They cut off their heads and made a mound with them. The muezzins called to prayer from atop this mound. The site of the Alcazaba of Uclés was razed after the battle, and the Saracens set course for their homes. The Christian garrison could breathe easy. They had saved their lives, at least for the moment, because it remained to be seen what the king would do when he found out that they had abandoned the reinforcement army to its fate. When the dust raised by the enemy army dissipated on the horizon, Uclés' men opened the gates and left the Alcazaba. A mix of soldiers and civilians headed west. But then, less than 200 meters from the fortress gates, they heard the Muslim battle cry. The armies of Murcia and Valencia had been lurking nearby and were now charging at them. There were hardly any prisoners. In one day, the cities of Uclés and Balinchon had fallen into Almoravid hands. The only male heir to the kingdom had been betrayed and executed, and after the defeat, other cities like Cuenca would fall into enemy hands. Alfonso was forced to name his daughter Urraca as the heir to the kingdom. But what was happening? Well, ladies and gentlemen, she was married to Alfonso the Further the Battler, and of course their son would inherit the crowns of Aragon and Leon, something that the nobles of the kingdom would not like. But we will see this in another chapter.